Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Eric Kaufmann. Eric Kaufmann is professor of politics and the director of the Center for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham. He's also an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Professor Kaufmann, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Alex.
Good to have you. And for old-time listeners of me and this show, you were on my last show, Agora Politics, where we spoke about one of your earlier books, that is White Shift, sort of a prelude to a sort of emergent white ethnic identity that was sort of more broad-based than traditional racial categories and sort of just involved, a set of like cultural signifiers that were going to become prominent as sort of like an expansive notion of that identity in the United States, Canada, and the UK. And that was based on a lot of your research on the electorate, in those places and different cultural attitudes and shifting forms of identification, which was quite interesting. But you have a new book out that was published earlier this year, summer, which is the Third Awokening, and that is going to be the topic of our conversation today. So, to get started, Professor Kaufmann, would you mind telling me a little bit about how you came to this book? It's a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism in the United States, and it has a somewhat nuanced take on sort of the generic approaches to counteracting wokeness. So why don't you tell me a little bit about what was the impetus for writing this book and then sort of give us a brief summary of the main thrust of the argument?
Sure. And I think it requires me to kind of set the table a little bit here because, really, if you look at my academic and intellectual interests over the course of almost 30 years now, it's really at the confluence of three different things. I mean, one is demographic shifts. The second is some kind of national or ethnic identification, particularly majority group ethnic identification. And the third is the origins and unfolding, if you like, of the cultural left.
Mhm.
So I've always had that interest in the cultural left, even going back to my first book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America. I was very much tracing the rise of this cultural left liberalism through the 19th and into the 20th century in particular. And so really what I've done, with the book White Shift, that was very much focusing on the sort of nationalism and majority ethnicity thing in the context of the great or the populist moment post 2014, 15, 16,
Mhm.
Brexit, Trump, the rise of the populist right in Europe. And now, what's interesting, of course, is we are now actually in a recurrence of that at an even higher level. But that's a topic for another time. But even in that book and also in White Shift, I do pay a fair amount of attention to the cultural left and particularly the um, taboos and restrictions on debate that have been put in place because of those taboos. So the inability of mainstream parties to discuss immigration, for example.
Mhm.
That was a theme behind trying to explain why populism was in the ascendant, is that the populists are people who are willing to break the taboos, which had become very narrow around what you're allowed to discuss. So that shows there's already a connector between the cultural left and the rise of the populist right. These two things are linked.
Mhm.
Um, Now, in the book, The Third Awakening, what I really do is major on focusing on that cultural left bit of that leg of the stool, if you like. Once again, as I sort of did to some degree in my first book. And what I do is I trace the rise of this movement. And I'm doing so in the context. So, White Shift was written just after the populist moment.
Mhm.
This book is coming in at the sort of towards the peak or the tail end of the Great Awakening, to use God, who was that now in Vox? That was Matt Iglesias's term, the
Mhm.
Great Awakening. So we had a period of rising, terms, social justice terms like white privilege, patriarchy, homophobia, all of these things were surging in the Washington Post, the New York Times. So we can measure this actually pretty precisely.
Mhm.
The number of people being no platformed and fired in universities. Again, FIRE has pretty good data. We can track all of that to a peak in about 2020, 2021. So it's in the context of that, I wanted to try and explain the rise of this phenomenon, the origin of this phenomenon. Now, a lot of books had come out, just as a lot of books had come out on the populist right. A lot of books have now come out on the woke left. People like Chris Rufo, Richard Hanania, Yasha Monk, Francis Fukuyama, Greg Lukianoff, a whole bunch of people have written books. And what I tried to do partly in this book is to say, well, I'm going to first of all, when it comes to the origin of this ideology, I am questioning how important the cultural Marxist bit, that sort of which James Lindsay and Chris Rufo in particular draw attention to,
Mm.
as opposed to what I would call bleeding heart liberalism, a sort of very kind of humanitarian, psychotherapeutic, uh, let's be kind to everybody liberalism, which I think is actually more important
Mm.
in explaining the emergence, the power of this phenomenon. And the second thing is I connected it to previous awakenings, which I think have been neglected. So that's really the theme. How did I come to this? Well, I've always kind of been interested in, as I mentioned, the cultural left. And so just when it had this surge leading to some quite crazy moral panics, I thought, well, this was naturally a topic I wanted to sink my teeth into. And I did it, as I did with my last book, looking at a lot of survey data and a lot of big data trends.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate, so for starters, just for full transparency, both to yourself as well as the audience, I actually haven't read the book yet, but I did review, some of your writings on it and some of the other things that have been posted about it. And I would just say that I think your argument, or at least the take on your argument, which, as you said, is sort of a in line, or at least part of a cohort of similar arguments on the origins of wokeness that have been presented in recent years, um, is is actually novel and does point to something very important, which is this sort of de-emphasizing of the sort of radical. Sometimes people use the term neo-Marxist
Mhm.
theory and philosophy that is sort of the intellectual underpinnings of a lot of the language that's used. And a stronger emphasis on the actual sort of realpolitik mechanism of action, which, as you stated, is sort of the general left-wing liberalism, as sort of a
Yeah.
dominant ideology. I think that's an important nuance to your argument that is distinct from the others that have been presented. And so I was very happy to see that, because I think it's an important point, and it's a somewhat nuanced point as well.
Well, thanks, Alex. Yeah, I mean, I think just to illustrate, this difference, right? If somebody says you can't say anyone can make it in America, let's just say, for the sake of argument, let's put it on a college campus.
Mm.
Um, is the argument, well, saying that upholds a structure of racial inequality, which we're going to call whiteness. Let's just say the sort of cultural Marxist type approach would be to say, well, that is upholding one of these invisible matrices somewhere in our psyches, this so-called structure, systemic, institutional, whatever you want to call it, racism, which is perpetuating inequality. That would be the very sort of pointy-headed kind of cultural Marxist type argument, right?
Mm.
Now, I'm not saying that doesn't occur. I'm not saying that there isn't critical race theory that is making that very argument. That is exactly what critical race theory is doing.
Mm.
I'm not saying that Angela Davis and Black Lives Matter or the elites, some of them are reading these ideas,
Yeah.
Delgado and Stefanchik and these ideas. But is that a more convincing explanation for example, cancel culture and speech codes, that people just don't want to allow this structure,
Mm.
systemic racism, to take place? Or is the more convincing explanation they think that it hurts and harms and is offensive to fragile, marginalized groups that'll make them feel emotionally unsafe, right? So I think it's that second,
Mm.
more harm-based, emotion-based argument
Mm.
that is really what's driving this, and not the first, which is with this very intellectual argument about structures of inequality somehow being reinforced by the words people use. At an intellectual level, of course, there are people and they have their disciples which Rufo talks about, and they hire them in academia and they perpetuate these critical theories and this gets us into Foucault and postmodernism and all these other things.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that doesn't matter at all. So I'm not, there's definitely continuities, but do I think that march through the institutions by deliberate march by cultural Marxists going back to Marcuse and Derek Bell and all this stuff,
Mhm.
is that really what gets us here? I don't actually think it is. I think that the bigger factor is this therapeutic concept creep. The word trauma, the meaning of that expands and expands. It's not just a physical thing, it's now this subjective mental thing that snowflakes sort of think, oh, I've been traumatized. And that is kind of something that's been inculcated by a certain kind of therapeutic. What if you trace the origins, it's the origin is in humanistic psychotherapy in the 60s. People like Carl Rogers, for example. And it's that creeping of that therapeutic language. And that's also, I think, behind the mental health crisis. This is really, in my view, much more important. So even if we got rid of all the cultural Marxism, I actually
Mhm.
don't think it would solve the problem because we have to remember be kind is an ideology. It's not some natural, normal. I mean, yes, of course, it's important to be kind to a point,
Mhm.
but obviously, are you going to be kind to somebody who's just killed your mother, right? I mean, there's an issue here around when is empathy pathological for a
Yeah.
society, and that's to my mind the bigger problem. And I know that God Sod is doing a book on this, but
Mhm.
that suicidal empathy, if you like,
Yeah.
pushing good ideas too far, that's the problem. And those ideas are more the kind of humanistic left liberal ones rather necessarily than the cultural Marxist ones.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a very good starting point, I guess, for kind of the nuance of the book, because I do agree with you that as someone who, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but like I went through like uh a very liberalized program where we had to become familiar with a lot of these texts, this sort of foundation of these neo-Marxist texts that people refer to.
Right.
And I always found the sort of etiological arguments going back to like the Frankfurt School to be a little bit vacuous, in that like
Right.
they do explain the terminology and they do explain the intellectual shrouding around it, but they don't actually tell you much about like what's operating in the internal minds of everyday people, or even a lot of the activists. Frankly, a lot of the
Mm.
activists aren't well versed enough in their own theories to really tell you much about them. They're just sort of using the language. Um, and so I like that you're pointing more towards sort of this almost quasi-religious foundations of left liberalism as the true culprit.
Yeah, I mean, I very much argue that what we have here is not a systematized, there's this dichotomy. I think Baron Cohen makes this dichotomy. Not the same Baron Cohen as Borat, mind you,
Hmm.
but no,
Yeah, there's
he
another
may,
Baron Cohen. They're both
yeah.
famous.
So he sort of makes this argument about empathizing versus systematizing. The empathizing is more the female brain, the systematizing more the male brain. But
Hmm.
this ideology is much more of that empathizing bottom up kind of system. It's not a system of ideas.
Hmm.
And so it's very much rooted in feeling really sorry for these particular cuddly minority, Black, Indigenous, gay, women, if we're talking about feminism,
Hmm.
and feeling really angry about whoever's doing the oppressing,
Yeah.
white male, typically,
Hmm.
straight, maybe. But so it's really based on very simple emotional valences. A plus, very positive emotion towards minorities, race, gender, sexual minorities, and minus, which is very negative outlook towards majorities or men. Um, so majority is good, minority is bad. That's a simple emotional structure behind this. There's no grand theory there. Now, out of that focus on these particular sacred groups, and I define woke as the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minorities. So these groups are made sacred in the system, which of course means, and they're sacred because there's an emotional attachment to them and hostility towards their oppressors.
Hmm.
Once that structure of taboos is in place, if you violate the sacred, if you say something that might be offensive to one of the totems
Hmm.
in this religious system, then, as with violation of a totem in a tribe, you are cast out of the community through what we would call cancellation, but in the past, this might have involved shunning of various kinds.
Hmm.
And this, in some societies today, a woman who is menstruating, who is shaking somebody's hand, would be the violation of a taboo, could get them cast out of the community. That's the same idea, is that there's something sacred and a taboo that has been affixed to these particular groups in this particular religious system, and it's very emotional. Uh, Alongside that, there is this very, what I would call fascist scare, this alarmism, moral panic over the cultural right, if you like. And
Hmm.
so, if we give an inch, we're going to be back in 1933 Germany or Jim Crow South, or so there's that paranoia attached to this as well. So it's that very kind of emotional structure, I think, that's driving all of this. Now, you can kind of extract some hazy principles out of those emotional attachments. And the principles are kind of like what Jonathan Haidt would call the equality and care harm moral foundations. So the idea that for these minority groups, they must have perfect equality and they must be protected from even the smallest microaggression, microscopic psychological harm. So harm protection and equal outcomes. And then, so equal outcomes, that's what we might call diversity and equity. So, affirmative action, for example, would be the example of, we have to have perfect representation of blacks in Harvard, for example.
Yeah.
Then you have the harm protection would be the I, or the inclusion. So we have the DEI, the I being any words that might hurt feelings and cause somebody to be emotionally traumatized
Yeah.
must be silenced through speech codes, clamping down on free speech. So that is really the I part, or the harm protection part of this.
Hmm. And so you also kind of give a sort of ironically, the argument is it kind of marginalizes the more extreme aspects. And I'm using that word,
Right.
as a pun, but the uh, the real, I guess, thrust of the power. I mean, you're essentially you're assigning complicity to mainstream left wing liberals for
Right.
the overtake of this, many of whom might even disagree with a lot of the actual resulting outcomes. Um, and so, uh, one, I think it's good to acknowledge that without some kind of majority support, or at least majority support in the institutions of power, something like this does not perpetuate itself. Um,
Yeah.
but then additionally, I wanted to ask, like, is this argument aimed towards those people, or is it more towards people that are already sympathetic to, um, I guess, is the argument aimed at mainstream left-wing liberals, or is it aimed more towards sort of the mainstream right liberal slash post-liberal right that has kind of emerged around this? Because I see a way that this could speak to either of those sides.
Well, ideally, the left liberals would read it. I think probably only the anti-woke left liberals are going to read it. I mean,
Hmm.
this new movie, which I haven't seen yet, from Matt Walsh
Hmm.
it's a sort of, I think it said, Am I a Racist? I can't
Yeah,
remember.
I think that's what it is.
But what's remarkable is he goes around interviewing these icons of the woke left, Robin DiAngelo and others, and nobody knows who he is. That he says, "Yeah, hi, I'm Matt." He's not disguising who he is, and
Hmm.
nobody's heard of him because there is a system now where any of these books on the culture war are completely shut down and isolated. So the left, the proper woke left, just doesn't read anything that's critical of the woke left. They just roll their eyes and say that's just a right-wing conspiracy. So unfortunately, I just don't think that this is going to be read by, certainly not by, the liberal left. It will be read by only the type of liberal leftist who sign the Harper's letter, or who is
Mm,
who is not a fan of this. And there are a significant number of those people. So that's my impression anyway.
mm,
Is it's probably going to land with similar groups of people that these other groups books land with.
mm. And I want to start getting a little bit into some of the sort of subtitle of the book, which is the plan for rolling back progressive extremism, um, and kind of figure out like, okay, so if we've established this premise where there is this quasi-religious, almost theological set of operations that are in place based on the assumptions of left liberalism, sort of always favoring the minority over the majority, having certain groups as kind of sacred, this kind of emphasis on harm culture. Some would say like a kind of like feminized just culture in general. Um, where do we begin to start putting the pieces together to rolling this back? You're making, from what I can tell, a somewhat pro-institution, institutionalist, that is, argument. There are others, for example, who are more extreme, who say that there's no way that you can reform the existing institutions or processes or the entire liberal structure itself needs to be torn down. You're not going that far. And in fact, you're making a very conservative move here and saying that we should actually try to preserve both our liberal institutions as well as a lot of these institutions that these are operating through, um, and push back in very procedural ways. So I want to get into some of your solutions for
Hmm.
sort of eradicating this cultural contagion.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is between the two camps, the one side which says, well, we got to just burn down the existing institutions, create our own, do it as much as possible, allow for things like school choice, build new universities, new schools, etc. I mean, my view is very much a both and. Like, I
Hmm,
think that's great. Let's do that. But I'm not confident that that's going to solve the issue for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, one of which is these established institutions have enormous advantages. It's the same way Google has an advantage as the search engine. It's going to be very hard to set up a separate search engine. You
hmm,
look at the attempt to set up a competition to Twitter prior to Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter. You had Gab and Parler and Truth Social and these things, they didn't really make much of a dent. And now the left is trying to do their alternative, and I predict that's not going to make much of a dent because you have this phenomenon is once these what's called network effects, and the larger the network, the more valuable it is, the more you have to be on it. And so, the left has tried to abandon Twitter now a few times, and they wind up crawling back because it's just
hmm,
too important. And the same could be true if we set up an alternative search engine because we think Google's biased. Similarly, with universities, it's important to set up alternatives. But I also, University of Austin and would be an example of that.
hmm,
But I also think we have to work on the mainstream institutions. Now, how do we do that? We do it through government regulation. So in this debate between what I call interventionists who will use state power and libertarians who think no, government is always bad and we must always do it through moral exhortation and private action and setting up separate institutions. I think you've got to actually use government action. And so I'm a supporter generally, not of everything DeSantis did, but of a lot of things that are happening in the red states where, for example, bans on critical race theory in schools, gender ideology, trying to get the indoctrination out of the school system, trying to work on a new curriculum that is balanced and contextualized, that doesn't just talk about the US stealing land from indigenous peoples, but talks about every country is about stealing land from whoever was there before. And so we actually have to talk, and similarly of slavery and whatever we
hmm,
want to talk about, it has to be put into world historical context. So that's what I mean is that can only be done through government. Now, there are a whole bunch of other things that have to happen before that becomes a reality. Now, the red states are already laboratories in what can be done on gender and critical race, and they are refining and getting better at writing laws that will be constitutional and that will also be detailed enough to squeeze out the loopholes and the wiggle room that the left will often, So a good example might be affirmative action at
Mm,
universities. If universities start to play games and to do this by proxy, then there's lawfare that can be undertaken to try and make sure that's very difficult to impossible.
mm,
You can have state legislative approaches. So there's a lot that we can do using legislation. Richard Hanania's book actually talks quite a bit about very specific legislation that can be used. And I just say, now, in order for this to work, however, the conservative parties and movements have to be a lot more focused on culture war issues and
mm,
have to start to see them as more important than they have. So one of the real problems is that the right has ignored these cultural issues, has left education to the left-wing educational establishment.
mm,
They need to actually get their hands dirty, get into the weeds, start cultivating talent that can be placed into bureaucratic positions that can, something like Project 2025, I think is actually very important. This idea
mm,
of cultivating a pipeline and careers, just the way the Federalist Society has done for the legal profession. So the Federalist Society has been very effective
mm,
in checking what would have been, in the absence of the conservative legal movement, a drift of the entire judiciary to the left. So the Supreme Court would be totally dominated by the left, as it is in Canada, for example.
mm,
That has been averted by deliberate and conscious movement by the Federalist Society. Something like that playbook is going to be needed for the bureaucracy as well. And also a set of lobby groups are going to be needed, equivalent to the NRA or the Christian Coalition in the past, but where for example, the abortion issue and the gun issue, the right punches is certainly at least at its weight, if not above its weight. On affirmative action, so I use the example of red states. 14 of them have restrictions on abortion, even though restrictions on abortion really only have about a 1/3 support in the US population. Affirmative action bans have about a 2/3 support, and yet there's only about 4 red states that have those bans in place. And that
mm,
tells you something. At this very popular issue, it would be an easy win. Why haven't they done it? And they haven't done it because they haven't cared enough and the lobby has not been organized enough. And so
mm,
those things are going to have to change. Part of the way they change, I think, is for conservative politicians, they need to be held to account by their constituents. And so that something like the scorecard system that the NRA or the religious right operate has to start being operated for culture war issues.
mm,
The last thing I would say is that culture war issues are not just about the culture war. And one of the problems that conservative politicians have had is they're not explaining this properly to their voters.
mm,
Um, you cannot understand why the border is not properly controlled, why crime isn't properly controlled, why educational results are terrible without understanding that those are all the result of the dominance of woke. So woke, when I say, making sacred historically marginalized racial, sexual groups. Because of that, if you talk about deportation, for example, or controlling a border, building a wall, that is all of a sudden attacked as racist.
mm,
Why? Because there's been a sacralization, making sacred of a particular racial group and a demonization of another group.
mm,
So until you unpack the demonization and do the cultural work to actually pare down that taboo and expose it and sort of make it more rational, you're not going to be able to get on top of the border. Similarly with crime, if every time one group is overrepresented in jail, for example, or in traffic stops or stop and search,
mm,
and you can't use that policy, you won't be able to get hold of the crime problem. And so all of these
mm,
problems are downstream of the culture war. And so you can't just say, oh, culture war is just something happening amongst the elites on campus. It doesn't affect anything else. Actually, it affects everything, not everything, but a lot of things. Military recruitment. If you don't have a patriotic young population, how are you going to get enough recruits for your military? Which, if you don't have a military, how are you going to do foreign policy?
mm.
All of these things are connected, and I don't think politicians yet have made those connections in the voters' minds.
Yeah, so that's a very valid point. I mean, people have been complaining for a long time about the conservative abandonment of culture. And in particular, on a lot of the the younger right scenes, there's this felt sense like you said, both the lack of professionalization and grooming in the positive sense of young conservatives into institutions and positions of power, but also investment in right-wing cultural movements, whether that's for policy initiatives or otherwise. Um, and there's sort of just been like I guess, an overemphasis on maybe formal legal battling on the right, which I think it a lot of what's left of the right is very comfortable doing. But they sort of lose out um, uh, on a lot of these cultural angles, and it becomes hard to actually even push your formal legal processes through when juries, judges, other kinds of prosecutors, et cetera, are all already working against you, you know?
Mm.
Something like disparate impact, which I would bet uh, Hanani talks about in his book, for example, is this kind of a policy that tells you that any kind of representation separate from the per capita cultural
Right.
ratios is inherently racist or sexist or whatever. If you can't get rid of that as a legal doctrine, then it doesn't matter what kind of cases you want to bring, because it's always just going to get reverted back to that oversimplified and frankly ridiculous statistical analysis. Um, so
Yeah.
the those I think are also good and valid critiques to make. One one point that I've heard you just as a refrain, and I think it's important that maybe we use this as an opportunity to disentangle these statements, is this idea that liberalism itself, or even Enlightenment values going more broadly, are to blame for the current state of affairs. And the notion is something like this: that liberalism, maybe liberal democracy especially, is something like a mechanism, and once you put it in place, the clock ticks forward; it doesn't tick backward, and it sort of always leans. The phrase would be like Cthulhu swims left. It always moves further and further into a left-wing direction. As you expand the franchise, you naturally get this domination of a notion of care and protection of these minority groups. And because of this mechanistic nature, it's impossible to reverse once you set this thing in motion. Therefore, all of liberalism itself needs to be scrapped. We can't hold on to even classical liberalism because that is merely um, trying to slow down the inevitable. And you are making a case against sort of dispensing with liberalism, and you are pushing for the virtue um, of right-wing liberalism or classical liberalism, Enlightenment values as such. And so I wanted to ask you, sort of getting to the weeds here a little bit on that component of the argument, because much of the people that I speak to today, and I think that my sympathies sort of uh, oscillate between these two camps. As someone who's sort of educated in classical liberalism myself, much of the people that I speak to today who are on the right, who are seriously thinking about these issues, would describe themselves as post-liberals. They would tell you that the entire liberal order needs to be torn down. It needs to be rethought. The Enlightenment was a mistake. I spoke to Charles Haywood a few weeks ago, who sort of has this very radicalized view and is very certain of it. And you are sort of coming in and saying, no, 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 we can keep our classical liberalism. It's not this uh, um, foregone conclusion. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that as a position, and sort of get from you, if I can, a defense of classical liberalism.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess really good question, and I think the first thing to do is to distinguish between what Isaiah Berlin would call negative liberalism and positive liberalism. So
Mm,
liberalism is obviously a very soft and stretchable word, so we have to kind of define what it means. The negative or procedural liberalism, which is what I support, is this idea of like, I have my right to swing my fist as long as up until it hits your nose. That's my right in terms of swinging my fist, and no further. Do unto others more or less as you'd have done to yourselves. But so that idea of a set of procedures that governs society, you have your sphere of rights and duties. That's kind of what I mean by liberalism. Now, what I don't mean by liberalism is what Berlin would call positive liberalism, which is
Hmm.
this idea of this is the ideal of society and of yourself that we need to promote and we need to push within us. So it's this idea that you should be against tradition, you should be in favor of difference rather than similarity, change rather than tradition. That idea is actually distinct because it is a positive idea of the good life or of society, and
Hmm.
what Berlin would call positive liberalism. Now, you could say, well, if you allow people freedom, inevitably you're going to get this ideal of individual autonomy and breaking with tradition emerging as the coercive ideal. I don't think that's necessary. If you look at the Far East, Japan, and places like Japan and Korea and so on, they would have the liberal procedures largely in place. They would not have as strong anywhere near as strong a kind of what I would call modernist or anti-traditionalist kind of emphasis in their society. So I think you can have the culture be traditionalist or at least be defensive of conservative values within a framework of liberal rights and duties, or that procedural negative liberalism.
Hmm.
I think in the past in the West, we've had that. Now, I think to some degree, Deneen is correct in arguing that we flipped from this procedural to this positive liberalism. A good way of thinking about that is we need to, procedural liberalism said you need to tolerate diversity, you need to tolerate diverse groups and positions and views,
Hmm.
whereas positive liberalism would say you must celebrate. You see the difference between tolerate and celebrate. And
Hmm.
of course, you can see that you could switch from that. I mean, you can have pronouns in your email to where are your pronouns? That's the
Yes.
difference that I'm talking about. And I think you can see how the one could flip into the other
But
because
we're
if,
getting close to the paradox of tolerance here.
yeah, because when you get a critical mass of people with pronouns in their bio, then suddenly there's a question like, why haven't you got your pronouns? So
Hmm.
I get it, but I still think it's possible to mount a robust conservative culture and have a conservative defense, but still uphold that liberal framework, which I think once you get rid of that framework, I think you're in a lot of trouble for a lot of different reasons. I think it then becomes a question of, you know, do you have rights to express yourself freely? And who decides whether you're allowed your free speech or not? And there's so many problems. If you can imagine quite easily, if the progressives got control of the governing apparatus, suddenly there's no more free speech. There's everything you say they don't like is disinformation or hate speech.
Hmm.
So I think I would defend what I would call, but clearly I think there are problems with the way liberalism has evolved in the West. I think that's largely cultural and orthogonal to the political structure. I think we can leave the political structure in place, but we need to pay more attention to culture. And a good example of this is just, I mean, you look at how much energy the right has poured into foreign policy, whether that's democracy promotion militarily, whether that's low tax, or even guns and abortion. They put all their energy into these traditional areas. And I'd
Hmm.
say that the elected, you take the United States, I'd say the elected congressional representation is still bathed in those earlier causes, and only some of them are in tune with what's happening with online podcasts, the intellectual right. Now, Vance does represent that.
Hmm.
So JD Vance is one of the first individuals who represents possibly the emergence, but without the intellectual right having more influence. As long as it is still the congressional political hack right, there's just going to be going back to the same old nostrums, and there isn't a lot of thought going into what has to happen on culture. So what really needs to happen is that the cultural right needs to become more influential politically and start shaping the political agenda, for example, in a way it has not yet been able to do.
Hmm. And do you, so making the cultural right more dominant, I think is important. One of the things that I think is also important to emphasize is not falling into um, very predictable uh, sort of potholes on the way to your own cultural ascendance. The right has always had this problem of, like if you already are in a position where, as you said, the left's automatic reaction is to demonize anything that looks even vaguely right wing.
Mm.
Um, and also, certain particular groups, men, white men in particular, et cetera, et cetera. Um, there is this, uh, there's this problem, or I guess not problem, but there's this uh, point of strategy that needs to be undertaken, which is to not become the thing, the monster that they say that you are. If you're going to
Right.
attempt to actually achieve a genuine cultural pushback. And I think one of the problems with the way that the right, even the segments of even the segments of the DC establishment that are sort of more in tune, maybe younger or more in tune with the online right or the intellectual right, is that they tend to flirt with a lot of these ideas and dangerous thinkers, et cetera. And I myself am also guilty of this. Um, and if you're not careful about how you engage with that material and what you say also as well in making your arguments, you can actually undermine your own political objectives by creating the well, basically by creating bad optics, by creating the justification for the fear that they supposedly have.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's an excellent point, Alec, because really we're in a game of persuasion in a democracy, right? And
hmm,
and it's often very finely balanced. And I do believe actually that people can be persuaded. I mean, one of the interesting things in my book, I do talk about what I consider to be this kind of generational time bomb of, Zoomers and millennials being very woke and, question after question, should James Damore have been fired? Should J.K. Rowling be dropped by publisher, Hamas or Israel? On all these questions, you're seeing a very scary looking public opinion coming out
hmm,
of Gen Z and millennials. And I think that's right. And I think that in 20 years, that is going to be a real issue. Now, however, I also think it's worth saying that just recently, I've noticed some things happening in the public opinion data. I'm Canadian, and in Canada, which has had this, essentially one-sided, completely left-wing dominated media, completely woke dominated political class.
hmm,
All of a sudden, you're seeing like younger Canadians shifting to the right.
hmm,
So they've had nothing but woke indoctrination in the school system and in terms of what they're getting in public institutions, and yet they're not swallowing this stuff, actually. I mean, some of them are, of course, and there's to some degree a gender divide to some degree, but actually that gives me some hope that actually there is a degree to which people are not simply molded by the institutions, and I think the online space is a big part of the online space is providing the alternative. And because online is still reasonably free, and because young people are not tuning into mainstream media as much, there is an opportunity there to have different views shaping a new generation. And so I guess I've become a little less pessimistic, perhaps even than I was in the book. Um, and I think there's a lot to play for in terms of persuasion now. One of the things that seems to have happened in Canada, for example, is a real alienation from Justin Trudeau, from young people. They're spinning problems that they're encountering, even mundane ones like house prices, on Trudeau to a greater extent, and people are changing their attitudes. And
hmm.
so there is more flex than I would have thought, actually. And so that I think and in Britain, there's been a shift too on certain issues like immigration and same-sex bathrooms, for example, or unisex bathrooms, quite substantially over in about 18 months
Hmm.
amongst that young group as well. So I'm kind of starting to think that what's happening online is having more of an impact than I thought.
So That's it's a good point that you brought up this the younger what seems to be kind of like a resistance to this this indoctrination because in your posts about the book that you made on Twitter where you talk about both books it has a different title in the UK as it does in the US. In the UK you're emphasizing the taboo component. In the US there's this awakening
Right.
terminology uh but you actually made an interesting uh, kind of extended analogy about this when describing the shift or the evolution of woke, which is that you made this sort of extended biological analogy to evolution. And now I'm not sure how complete or how lengthy you want to draw that analogy out, but I do think it is important to kind of think of it in terms of this uh, ecosystem of ideas where you can see that perhaps it may be that in places like the United States, Canada, the UK, maybe the Anglosphere more broadly, the places where these ideas take hold might also develop faster and more robust cultural sort of immunological defenses against them. Um, Wokeness has been described as a kind of autoimmune disorder of sorts, where you get the cells of the body attacking itself. And so there seems to be some general agreement conceptually, at least around using this biological analogy for these ideas. You sort of have Richard Dawkins coining the meme term itself. And so I wanted to just ask you about like the appropriateness of that analogy and whether you think that that reaction that you described among young people is sort of something like a resistance.
Yeah, I mean, it is resistance. It is resistance. I mean, I think the meme idea captures it very well. I mean, I would liken this a bit like COVID,
Hmm.
there are super spreaders. It's a mind virus. You catch it, you give it to somebody else. So obviously some people are more susceptible, less susceptible. They have immunities, there are no immunities. That's the best way of thinking about it. So it's spreading from the bottom up, a bit like an emergent virus, rather than the cultural Marxist plan to march through the institution. Now, I'm saying both of these things can be happening at the same time. And of course, it's possible the mind virus can take hold of an institution like the New York Times, which can then more deliberately try and inculcate this ideology. I mean, it's not incompatible, but yeah, I would say that biological meme metaphor is really the way I think of this as a mind virus. Um, the other way I think of it in terms of evolution is that, particularly when we're talking about left liberalism, that humanitarian left liberalism ratcheting up, getting more and more extreme in the boiling frog way, the water temperatures being increased. That's how we get to, for example, um, diversity training, affirmative action, speech codes. So some of what we think of as DEI, most of it, comes out of this ratcheting, evolving humanitarian left liberalism. So what Godsad would call suicidal empathy.
Hmm.
Now, you also have the cultural Marxist stuff, the whiteness, white supremacy, um, trans activism, for example, gender as a social construct. All of that stuff does come out of critical theory, but I don't think it could get anywhere without the sort of demand for the fertile soil provided by this kind of be kind style left liberalism. So the revolutionary, oh, we can't get the working class to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie, so we have to turn to ethnic minorities or gays or other groups to do the work of radical transformation. I mean, that I don't think that's the main thing going on. I think it is this evolving, oh, we've gotten nicer than we were in the past, but we got to get still nicer
Hmm.
to these very fragile, super fragile, ultra fragile groups. And so we've got to turn it up a notch and up a notch. And now we're talking about microaggressions and emotional safety instead of self-esteem. And then prior to that, we were talking about something else. So, and likewise, we see the terms evolve, crippled to disabled to differently able to, and that kind of evolution of terminology, I think, was reflecting this ratcheting left liberalism process.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, and then I guess one other thing I wanted to mention is sort of there's also this distinction between the context in the United States, in Canada, as well as on the continent, and even within Europe, in the UK, it's very different. The way that wokeness manifests itself takes different forms in all of these different contexts because these environments are different and they have different histories. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about like you obviously cross all three of those cultures, the UK, Canada, and the US, quite well, which is unusual for most individuals that would talk about
Right.
this topic. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about like what you see as the distinctions here, because to me, it feels like the United States has um, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The United States has almost the worst case as far as countries go that I could tell in terms of its relationship, especially to its history of um, of slavery and racism and racial segregation. It seems like the United States, for whatever contingent reasons, has a very difficult time psychologically reconciling this, and maybe that has to do with the also with the history of like um, religious movements in the U.S. that were always very like emancipatory. Um, but Canada is going to have a different sort of relationship, and so will the UK. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about those three different contexts and where you see the differences are.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I guess I see more similarities than differences. First of
Mm.
all, I think a lot of the symbols that are sacred are race, gender, sexuality are there in all three societies. Um, I see, it's predominantly an emotional movement focusing on particular groups and their narratives and struggles and particular oppressor groups. It's not a system of ideas. Emotional blackmail is the main tool that's used rather than some kind of systematic argument using data and evidence. It's very kind of, emotional. So now, are there slightly different emphases depending on the history? Yes. I mean, you can see that in Britain, the drive is towards shame over empire and colonialism and slavery, which is part of that. That's the emphasis there. Uh, in Canada, it's pushing hard on the indigenous thing, and I would say the Canadian thing is actually more extreme and crazy than the American thing right now,
Mm.
certainly. So, just to give you an example, another church was burned the other day, and that brings the total up to 112 churches that have been burned as a result of this basically Pizzagate level hoax about
Very
bodies.
profound.
Yeah, this idea that there are 215 indigenous children buried in this school and that they were taken out and killed, and the whole thing's a complete joke. Like there's no evidence. Not only are there no bodies, but there is no documentary evidence for anybody looking for a missing child. I mean, the whole thing is such a concoction.
Mm.
And it was essentially, there's this omerta around questioning it that has covered the entire political class, the entire media class, almost the entire media up until very recently. And there's almost an attempt now to criminalize people who are questioning this lie, essentially. So it's just a level of crazy that I don't think in the US, even at the height, even at the peak of the George Floyd, I don't think it was this crazy. So I think that shows you that the power of this ideology, that what you have is nobody will contradict anyone who's indigenous because they're sacred, and you can't say that an indigenous person is lying. That's just impossible. It would be unthinkable, right? I mean, just so
Mhm.
it's that level of sacredness that they're covered in, and so you can't have a truth-based society. You
Mm.
can't tell a truth-based history. You have to just hang your head in shame and sackcloth and ashes, and that's the only approach. Now, so now in Britain, of course, it manifests differently. It's around it's around the museums and what they got from the colonies, and it's around how they're interpreting, the national anthem, talking about rule Britannia, and everything gets questioned in light of empire and slavery. And there's only one acceptable view of empire. And now, the level of cancellation, the level of self-censorship is maybe a little bit less in Britain than in Canada and the US. But it's still pretty high. And in the university, if you're in the right sectors, foundations, arts and culture, universities, schools, you're getting pretty similar things going on.
Mm.
And now, of course, there are certain pushbacks. So Britain's been more successful pushing back on gender ideology and on the
Yeah.
trans agenda. The US is taking the lead in terms of critical race theory, in terms of combating affirmative action. The red states are definitely world policy innovators, and others are looking at what they're doing. So I'd say there's kind of, if you like, that resistance, that immunity, that vaccine, to use the metaphor, is being developed,
Mhm.
probably most in the US case. I would say that is where the politics of anti-woke DeSantis, is just more advanced. I would say the other countries are still, the right is still basically been wrong-footed, or is being shamed into silence. Canada is starting, you've just seen about several provinces, the more conservative ones are now starting to legislate on the, gender stuff. So Alberta just said, no, we're not going to have gender reassignment surgery below age 18. Schools are going to have to inform parents what they're teaching. So that is only just happening
Mm.
now in the last probably 6 months or so. Um, but yeah, I would still say the US is in the lead when it comes to innovating policy wise in how to combat this.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, I didn't complete my last thought on the part about the US being a mixed bag. What I was going to say as sort of the latter part of that was um, that the US in some ways has a very strong sort of legal frameworks with the division of federal and state powers, and the Constitution seems to be more strong, uh, that sort of allow more experimentation. And so I think that's you're seeing that happening now. And I guess what's one interesting point about that you said about the UK sort of speech culture and cancellation was that you said actually that the UK you thought was doing a better job, which is interesting because my albeit like very distant observations of the UK from here in the US uh, are that the legal speech protections are weaker in the UK. But your sounds to me like you're saying that the cultural ones are actually stronger.
You're right. I think the legal framework is strongest in the US with First Amendment, even though that doesn't cover, obviously, private universities
Hmm.
necessarily. Um, Britain, the legal is maybe not as strong as the US, although it's better than Canada, which I'll explain why in a minute. But I think that it has a relatively balanced um, political culture in the sense that its media is much more balanced. So there
Hmm.
are several very prominent, well-established right of center newspapers, the Telegraph and the Daily Mail, even to some degree the Times, which is kind of the mainstream paper. This is not the same as New York Times, Washington Post, and it's not the same as the Canadian, Globe and Mail and so on. So it's more balanced, and for that reason, actually, the cancel culture stuff has been criticized from very early on. Stuff that's happening in the universities is all over the press all the time. It's harder for them to just get away with it the way they do in, let's say, Canada, for example. And so even though the legal protections aren't as strong, now, of course, the other thing is there are some, because of the press coverage, associations like the Free Speech Union have been very prominent in fighting back. And there's a lot of support in the press for free speech. And so I think even though legally, we saw these so-called non-crime hate incidents where
Hmm.
people could be written up for doing things that were not a crime but could be pre-crime, that's been attacked heavily in the press and eventually led to action. And so I just think it's harder for them to get away with it. Now, in Canada, however, the judiciary, because there's only just beginning. There's nothing like a federalist society. The judiciary has drifted to the left to the point, and we've got our constitution, equivalent of the Constitution, allows for blatant racial discrimination, and that's been pushed more and more and more by universities. They're advertising for, we want somebody who, you can't be a white man. This is going on openly. Now, it
Mm.
happens, of course, in the US at universities, but it happens, they at least have to conceal it. So
Yeah.
um, it's with a compromised judiciary, I think that, not every judge, but I think there's a lot more problems with the Canadian judiciary. The British judiciary, my sense is they are drifting in that direction, but they're not that bad yet. So yeah, I think the picture in Britain isn't that bad because it's got that vibrant civil society and a mixed, balanced media.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's very helpful then, because I think it's also useful just to get kind of a perspective of the differences between those three spheres of influence. Because we
Yeah,
we only otherwise hear about things on X, and it can be very
right.
confusing what the state is of these cultural movements. But obviously, you've written the book taking into account there's the US version, there's the world version. I'm assuming the versions, the actual contents are basically the same, right?
Very similar. Yeah, it's very similar. And they also imitate each other, right? And so,
Hmm.
we've had a rise in cancel culture in Britain. Um, the newspaper content, the use of terms like white supremacy and patriarchy and all these things were very similar in all three societies. And so you have a lot of similar patterns. Now, the peaking of woke. So right now in the US, there has been a cutting back of DEI by tech firms. There has been less use of terms like white supremacy by mainstream media. There has been a decline in firings at universities. So there's been this walking back of DEI and other manifestations of wokeness. I would say that that is happening, but in a more muted way. In Britain, for example, the corporate DEI, they're stepping back from where they were 2 years ago. So it's happening, but I think it's not happening as publicly or as quickly. So I don't think
Hmm.
there are as many institutions in Britain. Now in the US, because of October 7th and so on, you have a number of universities saying, oh, we're politically neutral now. We're not going to take positions the way they took positions on everything from Trump to Black Lives Matter. They're saying, oh, no, we're going to be institutionally neutral. That has not yet really happened outside the US. And so I think a lot of the contrition, even though I think it's only surface contrition, but a lot of the stuff you're seeing in from the Ivy League, that has yet to really happen in a big way in Britain or in Canada. Canada, it's pretty much full throttle woke from what I can tell. It's certainly in the institutions. Now that could change because there is a conservative government that's far ahead in the polls, and Trudeau looks like he's going to be on his way out. So clearly we're going to have to see what happens when Trudeau is out.
Hmm.
Maybe we're going to see a big change, but I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
because the media is very unbalanced there. And the other thing I'd say in the US is because even though the print media is very left wing, the electronic media is more balanced with Fox. So you have a counter view that can shape politics.
Hmm. Do you have a vision for sort of the I guess I'm not going to ask for some utopian statement, but sort of the directional shift that could take place for this, and are you hopeful about where we're headed?
Well, I'm hopeful, but I'm also cautious because I do think things will get worse in some ways because of Gen Z millennials becoming the median voter, and they are less committed to free speech,
Hmm.
and they are more committed to so-called social justice. That worries me. But on the other hand, we've seen flexibility in some of their attitudes, and what I envision is probably these issues are going to be more important for politics. So there's going to be a strong anti-woke and a strong woke faction fighting it out, stronger than what we see now. So I see culture wars issues as those are going to rise up the agenda. I suppose my hope is eventually we win the argument. Eventually, what I call, in the Cold War, we had economic socialism or Marxism against the free world, which was basically liberal democracy and capitalism.
Hmm.
So I think the same clash between, except in culture, between what I call cultural socialism and what I would call cultural flourishing, that the cultural flourishing argument can become stronger and people can start to see cultural socialism the same way we used to see economic socialism as this thing that's immiserizing, that leads to a loss of creativity, a decline of human flourishing that causes a lot of problems, makes society in some ways poorer.
Hmm.
That if we can get that argument in people's minds that this cultural socialism equity stuff is going to make you poorer and worse off as a society, and we have to
And
fight
angrier.
against this. Yeah. Um, exactly. So I guess can we get there to because everyone kind of, there was a consensus that wouldn't be great to be under communism.
Hmm.
Can we get to a place where people say, okay, it wouldn't be great to be under cultural socialism because that is not a great society. Whereas a society that is happy and flourishing, where people are doing well and don't have mental illness, and where we have maybe a respect for the past a bit more. We have a military that can recruit. We have an education system that creates virtuous citizens. All of that stuff
Hmm.
would be the kind of vision. It needs a label. I use the term cultural flourishing, or you can use the term human flourishing. I think that's the opposite. That's the sort of antinomy to cultural socialism or woke. And I think just getting that vision in place and the argument, badging that argument, promoting that argument, I think that's the way forward.
All right. Well, Professor Kaufmann, thank you so much for coming on the show. The book is The Third Awokening in America, a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism.
Oh, I
It
should
comes.
say one last thing, Alex. Sorry to
Hmm.
interrupt. I should say I've also got a 15-week course on woke that anyone of your listeners can sign up to. If you just go to my Twitter pinned tweet, you can see more details.
Excellent, excellent. So go check out Professor Kaufmann's course, and you're also doing something with Peterson Academy, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing a number of different courses with Peterson Academy. But they're just standard, political science courses,
Hmm.
nothing particularly radical.
Well, if you're interested in doing some exploration outside of traditional university and you want to learn some political science, go
Yeah.
check that out too. All right, Eric Kaufmann, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Alex. It's been a slice.